Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to a bonus episode of Power Hour. I'm Alex Epstein. On this bonus episode, I am interviewing an economist I've become a big fan of lately. His name is Daniil Gorbatenko, and we're going to be discussing the controversial, but I think really hard to refute idea that I'm calling safer outside. This is a contrast to the idea of safer inside, which has been one of the themes of the virtually nationwide lockdown over the last 2 months, which is that to keep ourselves safe from COVID-19, we need to be mostly locked inside our homes and avoid going outside as much as possible. And I've been very suspicious of this, but in particular, when I started reading Daniil Gorbatenko's work, I really became convinced we're taking the exact wrong approach. And I think it's another illustration of how this lockdown is not at all a scientific phenomenon. It's an incredibly irrational political phenomenon that is misusing a very serious concern, namely SARS-CoV-2 or the new coronavirus. It's using that, but to basically abuse us politically with little or no benefit and doing things that in such a way that it's not helping us very much in terms of the disease. In many ways, it's counterproductive in terms of the disease, as well as really ruining the lives of tens, if not hundreds of millions of Americans. So I hope you enjoy this episode. And if you agree with it, I hope you really start to share this theme of safer outside. I think Daniel and I will probably work on an article together on this. And I think this can be one of the linchpins of challenging the narrative that the lockdown was a good idea, and thus that future lockdowns would be a good idea. Hope you enjoy. By the way, this interview is not going to be on video. The main reason was that Daniel is in a place where he's not allowed to get a haircut, as many people are having difficulty. Fortunately, in Orange County, I have a reliable person from whom I have illicitly gotten 2 haircuts during the lockdown. So if Gavin Newsom has an issue with that, I know probably does. He can come find me. But yeah, so Daniel didn't want to go on. And so yeah, it's just audio. But even if you're on YouTube, I hope you find it worth it. And if you're listening on iTunes or anywhere, not iTunes, but Apple Podcasts or anywhere else, it won't make any difference to you. Okay, with that in mind, here's the interview with Daniil Gorbatenko on Safer Outside. Before I bring on today's guest, Dr. Daniil Gorbatenko, an economist who's been writing really, really interesting stuff about this coronavirus, I wanted to give you a little context about how I came upon him and why I find his views so interesting. I actually don't remember how I got introduced to an article of his, but he had a Medium article, and it was about challenging the panic narrative around COVID-19. And those of you who know my views on this would know that I'm very sympathetic to this. But I read a lot of different stuff. And even the stuff where I agree with the conclusion generally, a general frustration of mine is that the level of precision of trying to understand the interrelated cause and effect of any given phenomenon is usually pretty weak. It's rare that somebody's really trying to give the big picture, to understand the big picture. And I was noticing just when I was following these stories about, we can call it SARS-CoV-2. I think that's the most formal name for the virus. Just there would be all of these things that even I, as obviously a non-virologist, non-epidemiologist, knew to be wrong. And some of these things I talked about in previous Power Hours, such as just the fact that people were not talking about the issue of dose. And yet it's so well known in viruses that the amount of the dose of something that you're exposed to has a huge effect on the fate of the virus. And yet people are talking about death rates of the virus, and it's devoid of the mention of dose. And yet that's something we know can make more than a 10x difference in terms of outcome. And a whole bunch of issues where just people are being not precise. And so I happened upon this article by Daniel, and I just want to read you some sections of it. And I'm going to read it to you both because I think it illustrates the level of precision that he's bringing in his analysis, and it also bears on today's topic, which is safer outside. So here's an excerpt from near the end of the article. Most people assume that every contact is equally likely to infect someone, and once infected, someone randomly becomes either mildly or severely ill. And I'll just pause. When I saw that, I thought, okay, this person is really thinking about this, because this point that, yes, somebody randomly becomes either mildly or severely ill, even the experts talking about this issue are at least putting forward that assumption. And it clearly makes no sense whatsoever given the nature of viruses. And yet everyone's taking it for granted. So I just immediately perked up as soon as I saw this, like, oh, this guy's really trying to make some of the relevant distinctions so that we can understand this. Okay, continuing. But long-standing line of research in virology suggests that this is not remotely the case. The severity of disease has been shown to depend dramatically on the viral dose and the capacity to spread disease further. And the capacity to spread disease further may depend on the severity of one's viral load. So that is that it affects you, what size dose you get, and also that could go on to affect how you spread it, whether you spread it, and to what extent you spread it. It says there is a mountain of evidence showing that COVID-19 spreads vastly better in closed spaces and through close contacts. And I'll just continue. He talks about examples, different kinds of examples of nursing homes and other confined spaces. And then he continues, this is starting to make the confinement of families, whether enforced through a direct order or a panic campaign and the closure of all public spaces, look a pretty dubious strategy. As a result of it, optimal conditions are created for the virus to spread in large doses to family members of those infected prior to the lockdown. And if the rate of cohabitation of the older and younger adults is high, you probably get ... the badly hit regions of Italy, where some of the worst hit communes have been under lockdown since February 22nd. It is important to note here that mass staying inside may reduce infections, but this is not the point if it leads to higher rates of severe disease and more deaths. Emphasis, Alex's. Add to it the social, economic, medical, and psychological toll of keeping the whole populations essentially under house arrests for months. All the draconian measures aimed at making people stay inside should be discontinued immediately, and the resources should be allocated to targeted measures such as serological testing. I'm just inserting that's mainly testing how many people in the population have had the disease by detecting antibodies. Testing suspected cases and screening of contacts, shielding the nursing homes to which COVID-19 has not yet spread, boosting ventilation at workplaces to get them to reopen, and so on. Some restrictions like those on mass gatherings in bars and restaurants can be useful, but their goal should not be to keep families sheltered at homes. So when I read this, I thought this guy is really trying to understand this issue precisely. What he's saying makes total sense in terms of imprisoning people in their homes being a very suboptimal strategy. I mean, that's an understatement, particularly if it increases the dose that they're exposed to. And then I also really liked how when he's talking about solutions, he talked about things that would be minimally coercive and maximally effective, such as focusing on nursing homes, which have been just a huge percentage of the deaths, and many of which I think are totally preventable. And I found it very intriguing that he's focused on ventilation, which makes sense if this is something that primarily spreads in confined, poorly ventilated indoor spaces. So I thought, whenever I find somebody who's really trying to think carefully about something and who's doing a lot more research than I am very intrigued. So I started promoting his stuff and introduced myself, and we had a couple conversations, and we decided to bring him on the show. So Daniil, welcome to Power Hour.
Thanks, Alex. It's an honor and pleasure to be here.
So let me start out by asking you, I know there's probably a long story here, but I'm interested in how you got interested in this issue, and if you agree with my positive assessment of your methodology, how you went, like, what do you think has led you to go about really trying to understand the interrelated causal factors of this?
So I got interested in this thing, especially interested when I heard in a podcast with Balaji Srivasan. I'm sure I'm torturing his surname, but it's an American investor who has a lot of following on Twitter, and it was early February, I think, and he was already and he was discussing what was happening in Wuhan in detail, and he was at that time very pessimistic, saying that this is first of all a very transmissible virus, and that at that at that time, especially if you believe the Chinese data, it seemed as though the CFR, and I should say it's an epidemiological term, so it's case fatality rate, so how many people die given out of the cases which are confirmed. So the CFR was very high, like in
So
100.
that's the ones that, just to interject because I'm big on this distinction. That's like diagnosed infections versus actual
Yeah,
infections.
exactly. So the CFR in Wuhan, especially early, was very high. It was like 5% maybe, and he was saying also that this was also causing a high rate of hospitalization, and especially a high proportion of people requiring critical care. So especially like not ventilation, but not the ventilation which I've been advocating, but using of artificial respirators basically to take over the job of the person's lungs because they cannot like ensure breathing anymore. So he was very pessimistic, and he was saying that this is going to reach the West, and that this is going to create the same sort of issues as it did in Wuhan. I think his forecast has partly been shown to be true and partly not, because we haven't actually seen a lot of overwhelmed ICUs, and I think one of the reasons for this is that in China there are actually very few ICU beds for their population, and that's why. So really, in reality, only some areas in Bergamo, in the province of Bergamo in Italy, that they saw completely overwhelmed ICU ICUs, but not not outside of it. So that made me interested in researching it further. So what's this virus, how it spreads, and what actually happened in Wuhan, and I saw what the Chinese did to address it, like the total lockdown, which was obviously worse than anything that happened in the West, in a sense, because maybe even worse than in Spain and Italy, because Spain and Italy are probably only the only two countries where you couldn't even go out to on your own to do exercise for weeks. You only could go out to satisfy like the most basic needs, like buying groceries or like really medical needs, stuff like that. And in Wuhan, basically, it went to the point where they were actually like people were not even allowed to go buy groceries, so they had to have stuff delivered like to their door. So I was like really scared by this, and I was hoping that this would not happen in the West, but I kind of had a nagging feeling that you could really have something similar. So I wrote an article, and I didn't know about as much about the virus as I think I know now, but I was still having already doubts about whether like the total lockdown was a good strategy. And later I learned that what actually probably kind of worked in Wuhan was not really total lockdown, but they they went actually door to door searching for people who are infected and isolated them, basically. So those who showed symptoms, they put them in separate quarantine. And also, by the time they started the lockdown there, it's actually more and more clear that Wuhan had a huge um, number of infected. Like the serological study there showed 10% of people in Wuhan probably were infected. And we also have increasing evidence that the epidemic there actually started like at least as early as November. And there's like some tantalizing new evidence that it actually might have started as early as October, because like in October in Wuhan there were international military games, and um, I've seen today like members of the French team and of the Swedish team testifying that many of the members got sick with symptoms which are very similar to to what COVID-19 causes in people with a disease which is not severe, because obviously people who participate in such games are young and probably fit, so usually COVID-19 wouldn't cause in them like very serious symptoms. But what they are saying, the symptoms that they say they had, and the location obviously suggests that it started even earlier than the earliest estimates. And then when it started in Italy, and especially what really shocked me and pushed me into action was on the 7th of March, the Italian government decided first to lock down, completely lock down the northern regions, which were the most like severely hit. And then on Monday the 10th, they decided to extend the lockdown to the whole country. And this really shocked me because I come from a country with an authoritarian regime, and I would have expected something like this.
You mean Russia?
Yeah, I would have expected something like this to happen in Russia or in China, but I would never, in my worst nightmares, I would never have expected something like this to happen in Italy and then spread. Because I think Italy actually, it was kind of the spark that started this lockdown fire everywhere, in a sense, because it's after Italy, and I was in France back then, and like everyone was already asking, so when are you going to lock down? They even on the French television, they had an interview with the former Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi, and like the journalists, they were really asking him like, so do you think that the fact that we're still not locked down, like, do you think it's like normal and stuff? And then like in a week their wish was kind of granted, so it kind of. And the last thing which really made me interested, I saw an article summarizing the views of Michael Levitt. He's a Nobel laureate in chemistry, but he's being in that summary, at least he was making some sense, because my background, I'm coming from economics, so I'm used to seeing mathematical models which are in my view greatly overused in economics, and I'm used to models that use very questionable assumptions, and mostly not because they allow the practitioners to illuminate the world to understand it better, but mostly because they just want to have this false rigor, seeming rigor of using mathematics, and when I saw what Levitt was saying about epidemiological models, that they were like what they were assuming essentially, I was kind of, I need to look into this. And so I what occurred to me is that, so I knew that I learned that epidemiological models, like the most basic one, let's say the Imperial College one that was released on the 16th of March, and that had so much of an impact. It's an SIR model. Basically, it doesn't matter. Like, there is a lot of technical details there, obviously, but it assumes exponential growth in the epidemic until the moment when the epidemic is discovered and some kind of measures are taken. And there is a related notion of R naught, and R naught is basically the average number of people that an infected person herself infects during the unchecked epidemic stage. So I thought, wait a minute, there is possibly an interesting way of seeing whether this exponential growth actually holds. Confirmed cases are obviously a very bad indicator, because this depends very much on who is tested and where and whatever. And I decided, but death, like reported death, not an ideal indicator, but probably better. So I looked into just basic thing. I looked into the region of Lombardy, which was the worst hit at the time, and still probably is the most hit. And I basically just plotted the death growth rate per day, and if the epidemic is actually exponential, you would expect that the death grows. And it's important also to understand that deaths happen with a lag. So on average, a person probably dies, if she dies, probably dies like 3 weeks after getting infected. So I thought that if you looked at the lag, you would see that instead of having the same rate of death growth, which would be true in the exponential epidemic, you actually see it like exploding first and then gradually trending down long before even before the epidemic essentially was discovered on February 23, 21. Sorry. And so this pushed me further into looking in all sort of details, and especially one line of research which we hopefully will discuss today is the research on an even more like micro aspect of how this works. Basically, how does it actually physically how does the virus physically get transmitted from one person to another, because there are various routes that are suggested, and obviously on COVID-19 is such a new disease, you need some firmer basis. So I looked into the influenza research, although obviously these are kind of somewhat different viruses in a sense, but given we are talking about physical aspects, not about what the virus does once it enters the cell, I think the influenza research is quite relevant, because in the end it's a viral particle flying through the air.
Yeah, so I think we'll get to that when we talk about the different elements of safer outside. Just one more preview question before we get into this specific issue. I think you've described it sometimes as taking the approach of a detective. How do you think? I guess how does your approach, do you think, differ from others? And then I'm curious, just the mechanics of it. Like, what are you doing in terms of research and whatnot on a daily basis? Because you tend to, when you talk about this, you seem to be familiar with a lot of the research, but you also seem to be pretty good at expressing degrees of confidence depending on how well established you think something is, which is a big thing I look for. So yeah, I'm curious how you think of your approach and then what it looks like to just get on top of this stuff, because obviously this was something new to you, but you at least have done a good job of convincing me that you're on top of it in a more integrated way than even a lot of specialists who obviously would know much more about different specifics involved.
Oh yeah, it's a complicated question, I would say. I mean, I think generally, I think that I'm I like much more the like qualitative research, so research which tries to look in to always ask like I think that science is first and foremost about understanding how things happen, and not, let's say, forecasting or predicting like aggregate patterns, like how many people will die in a given country by June 1, 2020 or something like this. So I think I don't think actually there is something special about me more than about the way, yeah, I like to approach this. And it's the same thing I always try to do in economics, is that I always ask myself a question: do I really understand how this happens? It was like, my thesis was on the Austrian business cycle theory. I don't know if you know about it.
Yes.
And even there, even though Austrians usually kind of tend to criticize like mainstream economic models, even there, like in the classic formulations, I still started by not being able to understand how it actually happens on the ground. How does someone start a misguided investment project, for example? How does it actually happen? So I think in this particular case of COVID-19, yeah, I always try to understand, especially like one of the most fascinating things in COVID-19, especially, are so-called super spreader events. Like events like the church in South Korea, for example, or the Mulhouse gathering of Catholics in the eastern region of France and stuff like that. So the events which clearly have had a huge impact on spreading the epidemic, and potentially these events explain why in some places it's so the scale of the epidemic is so much higher. For example, why, let's say, New Zealand or Norway have a much smaller epidemic and lower mortality than, let's say, I don't know, Belgium and France, for example. And so in all of these cases, I just try to ask myself a question. Okay, imagine you were at that gathering at Mulhouse, in that gathering where there are around 2,000 people coming and going for several days. So there is one person who is infected. He or she comes to this event. How does he or she manage to infect hundreds of participants of this event? How does it actually happen? I want to understand that. So I think it's the best way I could explain this, really.
Yeah, so I think that makes sense to me. And I think I have a similar kind of disposition where I want to. Maybe one way to think of it is I'm not usually attracted to the goal of making a mathematical model of something, but I want what I'm really excited by is just a precise mental model, or we could think of it as a causal model of how things work, including the nuances, and knowing that sometimes if I have that, I might not be able to make many predictions with it, but I'll at least be able to understand the mechanics of what's going on. And with it's I often get the sense, even with professionals, that they're not sufficiently interested, and in part there's been this feeling of different things like, oh, this doesn't really make sense. So with the super spreaders, which is one you've brought more to my attention, but there's this phenomenon of, okay, how is this actually working? Because they're saying there's no aerosol component, it's just spread by, being within 6 feet of somebody. And yet there seem to be these scenarios where people do seem to be getting it through the air, and in fact they seem to be getting it worse through the air, and nobody's really talking about that. And how is that possible? Was that a similar feeling that you had with those issues?
Yeah, exactly. The moment I read about like the differences between aerosol and droplet and large droplet transmission, I was thinking like, wait a moment, but how is it possible that someone can? And there are even like different events. Okay, you can say in Mulhouse, okay, it might have happened through one person infecting first a few people, and they continued spreading it over like several days, even though it's not proven that someone can start spreading like 2 days after getting infected. It's a very contentious issue, because what we know, and this is actually not surprising if you take virology into account, because usually, as I understood, I watched a video course on virology on MIT, I think, or Coursera, I don't remember exactly. the Actually, the top concentration of a virus in someone's organism when someone is infected is not when the person usually has the worst symptoms. It's usually like early, before the immune system has like responded in full gear, and so what it seems to be the case from in COVID-19 is that the peak infectiousness happens when the person has the initial symptoms, not like 20 days after infection. But it's not clear whether someone who has just been infected, 2 days ago, can actually transmit the virus. For example, I read the most recent study where I think these studies are the most interesting, and I wish there were more of them. It's a study from Taiwan. They summarize basically like about 100 cases of transmission to in various contexts, and there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Like obviously, like everywhere, the vast majority of spread is in households and all kinds of stuff. But what this study says is basically, in that study, none of the asymptomatic people actually managed to infect anyone. So it seems that the peak of infection happens when someone is starts having symptoms. So yeah, so when I learned about aerosols, and when I learned about the events like that South Korean church, which is even more impressive than the French super spreader event. But there are also other events, like, for example, I think in Argentina, where there is like a socialite coming back from Spain, and she's sick, but she doesn't realize she has COVID-19, so she goes to like a party and spreads it to scores of participants of that party. And obviously, again, you asked the question, but how is it possible if it's just close contact? Like how she doesn't spend an hour with every one of those 30 people.
Spitting in their
Yeah,
faces.
exactly. It's just, and beyond that, if we discuss like droplet and aerosol transmission, droplets. I mean, the reason, like, we can discuss it further on influenza research, especially. But the reason that mm, influenza researchers started to have doubts about large droplets as being the main route of transmission, well, it's because they are large, and large droplets cannot they have difficulty getting, so they can't get into the lower respiratory tract already. And they also, the upper respiratory tract seems to be better protected, especially in terms of the mucosal barrier. And generally, so they had doubts about the large droplets ability of actually seriously infecting someone. Yeah, so a lot of stuff here, but I hope I like started answering your question.
Yeah. I like, now I'm always looking for people with better approaches. And let's say the approach you're taking, I would describe as the exact opposite of that of our government in terms of just the science of it. I mean, there's a complete lack of acknowledging degrees of certainty and uncertainty, and as we'll talk about, just prescribing things, making claims, predictions that have very little basis and are often based on just complete, demonstrably wrong assumptions, and then making decisions and not explaining the decision. So what I would really love is for the professionals in the field, including the government agencies that are sharing information, to try to give us the most precise picture possible about how this actually works so we can make intelligent decisions, which then brings us to somebody who's doing the opposite of this, which is my governor, Gavin Newsom. So Gavin Newsom, I'm going to read you a quote from him. So the context is, he saw a photo of people on the beach in Newport Beach that, whether it was the angle of the photo or the reality or something, and his views on social distancing, he thought these people are too close together. And pretty soon after, he then said, you're banned from going on the beach. So I live in Laguna Beach, where we were mostly banned from going on the beach, but there was one county beach that's run by the county that's in Laguna Beach, so the city of Laguna Beach couldn't close it, and that was the hub of life in my area for a couple of weeks, and it was really heartening to see people actually going outside and enjoying themselves. And now when you go there, it says closed by executive order of the governor. And here's one of the things, and the idea is this is keeping us healthy. I'm saving lives. And he says, this virus doesn't take the weekends off. This virus doesn't go home because it's a beautiful sunny day around our coasts. So I'll just start off by asking you broadly, what's your reaction to Newsom's policy of telling us to stay inside our homes and telling us to stay off the beaches?
Well, yeah, I obviously think that this is probably good politics and good demagoguery, um, given his electorate, and obviously in the U.S., the Democratic electorate has, for some reason, maybe especially because they are against Trump, and I'm myself not at all a fan of Trump, but given that Trump initially was reluctant to admit the seriousness of COVID-19, the obvious tribalist reaction was to become anti-Trump and to embrace the sort of high level of concern and urgency about the virus. So I think what he says is obviously good politics, but it doesn't have any serious grounding in reality. I mean, there is now ample research, showing that there's I wouldn't say there is evidence of no spread outside, because we can almost never say that, but there is, let's say, there is almost no evidence of spread outside, in the sense that, for example, there is a large Chinese study where they studied 318 clusters of infection, and they found only one involving just two people where it probably happened outside. But even this, like, when you have just one out of hundreds, you might ask yourself a question whether that really happened outside, or whether the person, and it involved just two people, so it strengthens the case. If it involved several people outside, it would be more difficult to question. But when it involved just two people outside, you start asking the question, okay. And also the details, there are that two young people were talking to each other, so it's a bit questionable, but possible, but unlikely in my view. Just
So
probably that person could not remember how, or didn't want to tell that he or she actually interacted with that person. But anyway, and the second study, which is also interesting, has been done in Gangelt. Gangelt is an area in the west of Germany, which is sort of the German Wuhan. It's the most affected area. And the group of epidemiologists who studied in detail how the virus spread there, they not just couldn't find any spread like outdoors, but they actually couldn't find, they had trouble finding spread even in restaurants. So it starts to suggest that maybe you need some special conditions for it to spread. Like maybe you need places where there are a lot of people at the same time, or places where there is poor ventilation, or if we talk about it further, you need someone who is for some reason emitting a lot of virus, because of some some something, whether the severity of the person's infection, or some kind of something about the anatomy of the respiratory tract, or maybe vocal cords or whatever. But yeah, so that German study is particularly interesting. And in general, I haven't, as much as I looked, I haven't seen any evidence of much evidence of outdoor spread, of so and yeah, I'll let you say now, but obviously we can talk also how bad it is actually, and what are the negative consequences of keeping people inside.
yeah, so we'll get to that in a minute, but just so you indicated a little bit, but what's in terms of what are the researchers saying about the mechanisms that make it, I mean, leaving aside the health benefits of being outside, but just why it seems very low risk, certainly of any kind of high dose transmission, but maybe even of any transmission. Like, what are the mechanisms? Is it just that the air, that because outside is the air mixes so much? What is it?
Yeah, so we'll get to the question whether the droplet route or the aerosol route, which is important, but at least for the aerosol route, the connection is obvious. So aerosol is, so the distinction there is not like watertight, but it's not like that when we speak or cough or sneeze, we produce droplets of various sizes. And there is not, it's obviously a continuum, but I think the best difference that can be summarized is that the largest of those droplets, they have a sort of ballistic trajectory. They behave like, if you throw a ball, it makes this trajectory, like basically parabolic, in a sense. But it's so heavy that those large droplets are so heavy that they either should reach an object like a person's face or something like this, or they will fall to the ground. Whereas smaller droplets, which are called aerosols, they are light, and they also dry out. And when they dry out, they become really light. And this basically, it remains essentially, you have highly concentrated virus, flying. And there is a fascinating Japanese video from Japanese researchers who actually tried to look what happens when two people are talking to each other, or when someone coughs in a room full of people, what happens? And they show that the large droplets, they fall quickly, but the aerosols in a space without any ventilation, they continue to float, and they will not disappear unless an airflow intervenes. And outside, obviously, a lot of things change at the same time. So first of all, outside, I guess there's always, even if we don't notice it, there are always flows of air. So this quickly dilutes the concentration. And virus is poison, so any poison depends on concentration. So even if you inhale just a little bit, probably outside, the probability of inhaling enough aerosol to get, I mean, I guess if you, I don't know, if you kiss someone outside, you can get it. Or if you like really spend
Yeah,
hours
I mean, if you
face to
swap,
face,
yeah, I mean, if
30
you both spit
centimeters.
into cups and drink it, and I
Yeah,
mean, yeah.
but
But
otherwise,
so it
on the
seems like with both aerosol and droplets, it would get significantly diluted by just the airflow of being outside, or
yeah,
or
but especially
lessened.
the aerosol, yeah.
Okay,
and
so
and the second thing is also with aerosol, also it seems to be that the virus is vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation. So even if it floats somewhere, if it floats in direct sunlight, it will quickly probably get deactivated and stuff like this. So, but there is another big benefit of staying outside, and I guess we can discuss that. It's
yeah, so
vitamin
let's go to
vitamin
that
D. Yeah.
in a second. But just to summarize, so yeah, I mean, we have just in terms of lesson. I mean, so if we think about this in the context of, I think, a lot of evidence to say this is very contagious virus that's dose dependent in terms of its danger. It's also demographic dependent in terms of its danger, but it's certainly dose dependent in terms of its danger. And so, in general, your goal, I think a rational goal for most people, is make sure I don't get a high dose of it and expect that I'll get a dose at some point, but make it a low dose. Well, actually, first let me ask: do you agree with that, or feel free to counter that?
Oh yeah, certainly. Even I would even say that you maybe would want as many people as possible to get small doses, because this would potentially give them immunity without causing significant symptoms, and then it could protect in the future other members of the community from actually getting infected, sort of boosting herd immunity through low dose exposure in a sense. And
Yeah,
there's
so
a
I mean, it's
certain,
interesting because I think from an individual perspective, in a sense, I think you'd kind of, all things being equal, you have some value to delaying your exposure, but the main value is to lowering the dosage of the exposure. But I think it's very arguable that from a societal perspective, you want to minimize the dose and have it as early as possible, at least for for those who are not expected to have a severe response. It's interesting because, of course, the whole way policy is proceeding is not to take dose into account at all and try to delay people from getting it as much as possible. So we have, and so basically, if the main goal with something like this that can't really be contained is, so you want to minimize the dose that you get, and then okay, being outdoors is really good for that in terms of lowering the dose and in terms of, to some extent, neutralizing it with sunlight. So even on that basis alone, you would say go outside as much as possible. Like that would be like a health recommendation, or at least, I mean, you would even, I think, be encouraging people to go outside much more than they normally do. I tend to go outside a lot. I know you do as well, just because we've talked about we both need our walks for our intellectual work and for our mental health. But I think, would you agree? I mean, even on just in terms of minimizing the risk of the virus, wouldn't you agree that officials sharing information should be encouraging us to go outside, even leaving aside the other benefits?
yeah, for several reasons. Well, first of all, it's also very interesting because the dose exposure also probably doesn't happen in one go. It's not like you receive the dose like you drink a poison. it might take place for hours. And it's also interesting what happens inside the body. There was a great article in New Yorker, where a woman who got her education in virology, she was saying, but like, it's probably a very complex interaction between the disease and the organism inside. And so even if you imagine, like, you are with someone, let's say in the apartment, and that someone is sick, you can even imagine, because it's sort of a dynamic equilibrium in your body, you could even ask yourself, okay, imagine that if I get the exposure for 2 hours, but then I go out for several hours and then I return, that this could maybe make a difference, even though what I'm saying here is very, very speculative, obviously. um, but yeah, I mean, this can minimize the dose exposure. Also matters over time, in a sense. And there's also some really interesting research about the Spanish influenza pandemic, because, like, we still don't know why it was so lethal. So the leading hypothesis is that it was bacterial superinfection in a pre-antibiotic era, and all the problems created by the World War, the weakened populations, the mass gathering of military, and especially like the wounded people in camps and military hospitals and stuff like that. But there's also an interesting paper in PLOS ONE, making a hypothesis that the second wave in the autumn of 1918 was so deadly because you had, and they look into like a study in Iceland, because you had because you had people in households with one or several people who were infected in the same time. So it multiplied kind of the dose which people were receiving. And Spanish influenza is different from COVID-19 in a very big sense, in the sense that young people, like a certain age subset of young people, was highly affected by the thing. So it but the point remains that the more you can reduce your exposure over time, the better. Like, second very important point is that, and obviously if you are sick, you also reduce the exposure to other people who are with you in the same environment, so it works kind of both ways. But the second point, which is also very important,
That's a big one, by the way. So I just want to highlight that. Right. I
yeah.
mean, it's like, yeah. So go ahead with your next point.
Yeah. So the second point, and a huge one, is vitamin D. So there is like increasing
Well, so let
evidence.
me. Sorry, I just want to interrupt you. I don't know if it'll be the last interruption, but it'll. I just want to frame it, because here's how I'm thinking of it, just to give a simplified version, and then I want to go into vitamin D. Is you could think of it as, I think in general what our goal should be as individuals, and largely as aggregations of individuals, is to minimize is to get a minimal dose, and also to maximize our immunity. Right? Because if we have a well-functioning immune system with a minimal dose, that's the recipe for being asymptomatic or certainly healthy for the vast majority of people. And so if we think about, so far we've talked about outside is great for minimizing dose. Being inside is where people are getting high doses and getting really sick, and even a huge percentage of the infections are even within families. And even if it's there's the case of the college kids being brought with their parents, so there's the forced mixing at the beginning of the lockdown, but then there's also, because people do have to travel outside their homes for other things, and they're going in other confined spaces like Walmarts and whatnot, then over time there are going to be risks as well. So I think it's an enduring risk of higher dose contamination inside. So outside gives you lower dose, inside gives you higher dose. And now let's move on to immunity. So what you're saying is outside gives you higher immunity, and so now talk about vitamin D.
But I will add something else, because you made me think about something else. So there's also evidence, although it's not like conclusive, but there is evidence that making people spend most of the time indoors during the epidemic may actually highly exacerbate this spread. So first of all, those studies which look at something epidemiologists call secondary attack rate, meaning secondary attack rate is is relevant to a particular context. So secondary attack rate in households means how many people an average infected person infects in the household. So what is the probability of infecting a person in the household? And what's interesting is that when you look at those studies which were done in countries without total lockdown, like Germany or um, Germany or South Korea or Taiwan. Although it's not clear because I don't know how much we can trust the Chinese data, like quantitatively. But those studies suggest that the secondary attack rate in those situations was like 13-15%, whereas the Italian data is saying that the 25% of all cases from households. So I don't know how it's difficult to directly compare, but it might be that in Italy you have a lot more people within households with severe disease because of the lockdown. And yeah, and switching to vitamin D. So vitamin D is very important for the functioning of the immune system. It is one of the key hypotheses why diseases like influenza or common cold are seasonal. The hypothesis is that basically people spend too much time inside and they don't get enough sunlight exposure, and that lowers the immune system. And there is also corroborating evidence for COVID-19. So there are a bunch of countries, especially Italy and Spain, have been very badly hit, and there is a research showing that it is particularly people in Spain and Italy who have the lowest levels of, especially the elderly, who have the lowest levels of vitamin D, approaching and often going beyond, like going into vitamin D deficiency territory. But also very interesting, everyone probably noticed that in New York especially you have a much higher percentage of ethnic minorities with severe disease and mortality. And it is no surprise that among them the levels of vitamin D deficiency are much higher, probably because the darker skin you have, the more difficult it is for you, especially in winter months, to get enough sun exposure, because if you are darker skinned you need more sunlight to get more enough vitamin
The
D
same
for you.
amount of vitamin D.
Yeah. So, and the third obviously important point is that they studied people and they found like that almost everyone, like several studies, almost everyone with severe form a severe form of the disease. Although I need a caveat is that those studies are not like with thousands of people, but they're smaller. But in those studies it seems to be that like the vast majority of people with the severe form of the disease with vitamin D, like have low vitamin D or vitamin D deficiency. And it's not just, by the way, it might be not just the immune system that suffers from vitamin D deficiency, but vitamin D is also seems to be important for, it can reduce thrombosis, and thrombosis is increasingly recognized as one of the key, I mean, either the virus directly or the reaction of the immune system does something that causes thrombosis, blood clots in COVID-19 patients. So it can be either the thrombosis of the lungs, or in some very rare cases young people have no symptoms but they have a blood clot in an artery which goes to the brain. And so there were rare cases where people had strokes because of that. But anyway, it badly affects the blood circulation, and it's increasingly seems that this is the key mechanism why even like how the lungs stop functioning, because it was the Italian doctors who found it first that many of the patients had lungs which were not actually as damaged as expected physically. So the lungs could do the pumping work, like, but there was something that those patients, to those doctors, those patients resembled people with altitude sickness, not people whose lungs are rigid and full, so much filled with fluid that they cannot contract anymore, but that something was preventing the oxygen from going into the blood circulation, basically. And so, like, obviously you could imagine a different way of supplying people with vitamin D. So you could say, okay, supplementation. But from what I've seen, even though here I'm not confident about what I'm saying at all, in the sense that, and it seems to be not clear from the existing research whether vitamin D supplementation can replace sunlight in this regard. So I'm not gonna opine on this, but I think, yeah, letting people go outside and get their sun, and especially, like, because now it's like May, not February, like, I mean, it's the better, because in winter there is also the question, like, one of the reasons why people think that people get respiratory diseases in winter is because of what cold air might do to your respiratory tract. But now it's May, so even this effect, so I think, yeah, I think for all these reasons, I think not people should not be told to stay at home, but they should be, like, strongly advised to spend as much time as possible outside, and the warm weather is helpful in this regard. So I think.
Great. So let's just probably only have 5 or 10 more minutes, but I just want to start enumerating other benefits. So let's start with any other immune health type benefits of being outside, and then we'll talk about immune problems with being stuck inside for long periods of time.
Well, in this sense, I will need to say that I did not study. I'm not a doctor, so I studied these points in particular because I've seen them appear in the research literature. I think obviously there are benefits of more movement, so like, even for thrombosis, I think that being inactive physically for a long time probably doesn't help with better blood circulation. And yeah, obviously also the psychological benefits of going outside, changing the environment and stuff like that. I think it could be beneficial, and even, like, this is like, even for a relationship, just because staying all the time with the same people in the same apartment, and obviously, like, it's not a joke, because it's clear that being confined with all the time with the same people increases levels of like in like conjugal violence, stuff like that. So I think there are probably a lot of benefits of frequently going outside in this sense too.
Well, I mean, ones I think about are, all the physical ones connected to mental health. So just even think about it, common sense. Like, what happens if you're stuck outside? That it has to have an inverse relation. Stuck inside, rather, has an inverse relationship to mental health. I mean, just generally, I think being outdoors
Yeah, that's why
improves
that's why we
people's mood.
punish people by putting them in prison.
Yeah, not on the beach.
Yeah.
Yeah, prison is not at Laguna Beach. It's although, yeah, it could be counterintuitive. I mean, you could argue maybe they're not getting enough sunlight and be better insofar as anyone's trying to rehabilitate. But you just think about what's happening, like being stuck indoors, what that does in terms of depression levels, and then what depression levels do in terms of intake of non-ideal substances, both alcohol, different kinds of recreational drugs, but also less healthy food. I mean, you're seeing all the, just so much of a focus on takeout and Uber Eats and stuff like this. And it's just, and I have this experience, I'm sure other people do, that the worse I'm feeling, the more I seek stimulation
Oh yeah, yeah,
from less
definitely.
healthy food substances, stuff like that. And part of it is just that there's a certain pleasure associated with that. And when there's no stimulation, or it's hard to get stimulation from other things, we seek what we can. I mean, pleasure is an essential. I'll even admit that I've gone to the grocery store way more just as like something that I can control, particularly not now, but maybe a month ago. Like, this is something I can control, and just getting a treat at the grocery store, like, hey, that's a source of pleasure that I am able to get. And so, of course, going to the grocery store is not as good as going to the beach
Oh yeah, and
in
and
terms of
adding here,
health.
by the way, obesity is, or being highly overweight, is a huge risk factor also in COVID-19, and that's why, for example, the U.S. has higher mortality, even though still much lower than in the older age categories, but still like higher than in Europe. You have a lot of people in their 40s or 50s which have very severe disease, which in Europe is almost, the UK especially, not surprising because the has the highest obesity level in Europe. But in Netherlands, I also read reports that even ICU doctors and nurses, they had to say, look, but almost everyone we see, like a lot of people, especially younger, are obese patients basically in the ICU. So obviously, yeah, the lack of activity and the need, yeah, to have treats, yeah. And I caught myself like consuming more like sugary stuff, and during, because I don't have other than distractions, yeah, yeah. So definitely not a good thing.
Yeah, but people, I just think as a common sense thing, when we're exercising, when we're outside, when we have good social connection, it's just there's not that same feeling of, oh yeah, I really need to just escape in a certain sense with this kind of pleasure, like have a little pleasure escape. So I want to just give an overview of what I think is important about this, and then just connect to the political or some political implications. So yeah, I think just to go back to the framework I've been using, I think a lot of it in terms of what makes sense for individuals and largely for society is for most of us to focus on reducing, getting a low dose exposure, like minimizing the dose of our exposure, which is different from preventing exposure, and then to maximize our immunity. And on both counts, being outside is really, really good for us, and and for others, for that matter, in terms of reducing any dose of our transmission. And it's really good in terms of reducing the dose, and it's really good in terms of heightening immunity, and being locked inside or imprisoned inside or encouraged to stay inside is you have definitely a higher risk of a higher dose, which I think is the key thing. Risk of infection, I think there's a question, but risk of a higher dose, I think, is definitely much higher if you're inside. I mean, much higher if you're inside all the time. So that means risk of a really adverse outcome, and then decline of immunity is also a big thing. So what we have is that and notice we've barely talked at all, if at all, about the other negative consequences of this universal home imprisonment, as I sometimes call it. So I've really wanted to focus on this because there is this mythology, I think, that okay, the lockdown was a really good, intelligent, scientific way of minimizing the danger of this disease to individuals and to the society at large. Like, okay, the lockdown was a good thing there, but most sane people recognize it had huge adverse consequences, including health consequences. But what I want to emphasize here is no, the lockdown was not scientific, and particularly in terms of either forcing people, or forcibly preventing people from being outdoors or encouraging them to not be outdoors. It has done immense damage, even in terms of the danger of COVID-19, leaving aside the incalculably larger damage that it's done in every other area of life. So I have one more implication of that, but do you agree with that, or do you have some amendment or elaboration on that?
Yeah, definitely. And to add to the like scientific thing, actually, if you look, because obviously before like late December, like before December 2000, like January, I would say 2020, COVID-19 was not subject of much scientific research. So what evidence about like spread of respiratory diseases and the measures to counteract it existed, that evidence was from influenza, a disease which we've been facing for hundreds of years. And actually, what's interesting, first of all, what I saw there are several studies, but there is, for example, a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is not a direct study, but a study summarizing a lot of other studies, so to speak. And what they honestly said, and what shocked me when I read it, like the first phrase of the abstract says, well, little is known definitively about how influenza transmits. So it's kind of okay. So we are told from early on that all the measures are based on rock solid science, and then you open a meta-analysis, and not something written in 1960, but something written in 2013, and it says like, yeah, actually we don't know, definitively how it spreads, but it then goes on to summarize a lot of studies about the modes of transmission, so droplets, surface. By the way, there has been and still is not any evidence whatsoever of spread through surfaces. So um,
And I
like
think that's pretty common sense.
yeah,
Just
even
like,
though there was so much emphasis on washing hands, and I don't, don't get me wrong, washing hands deactivates the virus which you have on the hands. But the thing is that the virus doesn't have legs and stuff, so it's like from getting into onto the hands, it has like a long way to go before it can infect you. But also, like the German study which I mentioned in Gangelt, they isolated some virus from surfaces, but they couldn't, like they brought it back to the lab, but they couldn't cultivate it in culture, even though obviously there are a lot of caveats, like it seems that coronaviruses are difficult to cultivate in culture in general. So it's there are questions about it, but the point is that we were told that all this like completely sensible measures were based on rock solid science, like as if it were like Newtonian physics of large objects. But like obviously it's not the case. And in that like overview, it also touches upon social distancing, and actually it says that there is not much, if any, evidence for it. And on lockdowns, I can't even say anything, because lockdowns is honestly, it's something which is absolutely unprecedented, like in the sense that nothing like this was ever attempted at such scale in
yeah, when I
history.
had, I don't know if you ever heard my conversation with Onkar Gate from a couple weeks ago, but he had researched this, and he just said, the CDC never, when they're talking about severe influenza pandemic risk, like they never contemplated even a citywide lockdown, let alone state or country wide
And also
lockdown.
legally, for example, I don't know about, like, obviously the US Constitution doesn't mention anything like this, but even the Italian
Well, but
Constitution,
the U.S. Constitution is supposed to say the only things
yeah,
you're allowed to do, and I mean it says definitely things
yeah,
about due process of law. You
but
can't
even
deprive of life, liberty, or property, or
yeah,
interfere with the
yeah.
freedom to assemble.
Yeah, but I was actually surprised that no one actually challenged the thing in the US on the constitutionality grounds. But well, I think they did, but on a very narrow kind of basis. But even in Italy, they to justify this lockdown, they used an article of the constitution which, like, if we look at the historical rationale of this article being in it, it's about like quarantining a boat or a building, but it's not remotely something which could justify. Although we know about creative constitutional interpretation even from the history of
Yeah,
U.S. Supreme Court, so it's obviously, but still, I mean, yeah. So so I think, yeah, scientifically speaking, lockdowns are something completely. It's like in economics, there was never theoretical evidence for what Federal Reserve did in 2008 and even worse things that the Federal Reserve is doing today, and other central banks. It's the same thing. Like there was ever any science before COVID-19. There was no science supporting lockdowns. It's just insane. It's an insane measure.
So, to wrap up, I have someone was being interviewed yesterday by somebody, and I was talking about Governor Newsom's policies, and the host said, well, he's a personal friend of mine, and I said, well, send my non-compliments, because I'm just so upset about what's happening, and the reason I want to talk about this issue in particular of safer outside is, again, because it shows not only the coercive character of the lockdown and the cruelty of the lockdown, but just the completely unscientific character of it, where it's actually ordering us to do things that are bad for us with the disease it's supposed to protect us from. So it's not just that that it's forcing us to protect ourselves from this at too high a cost. That is, even on an individual level, it's forcing us to have a risk profile with COVID-19 that we would never have. We would choose to accept more risk and actually be able to act in our lives in most cases, but it's increasing for many of us our risk of getting a dangerous infection, and that's something that really needs to be pointed out, because I really appreciate that your work is doing this, and a lot of my work is focused on this. It's really important that this lockdown not happen again, and part of it not happening again is realizing this was the wrong response in the first place. Not this was a reasonable response, not there was evidence for this, not, well, we didn't have any evidence, so this is the thing that makes sense. This was a panic response that was immoral and that was irrational, even with respect to the virus, let alone to our lives as a whole. So, Daniil, I'll give you the last word. Any final thoughts you want to share with the audience on this before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what you said, and I think people, yeah, I think the best thing people can do is ask themselves, yeah, how could this have happened, and how can we prevent, because it is not the last crisis that is gonna happen um, to humanity, to particular countries, and we really should maybe go even beyond the context of the epidemic and ask ourselves the question, like, how have we gone to the point where collectively as a polity we end up having such a completely irrational and counterproductive reaction, and especially not focusing, like, one thing that one would want to mention as an economist, you would also like to focus on like what is unseen, not what just what is seen, but what is unseen. And the thing that was unseen in the beginning, but which is actually like an elephant in the room, or maybe a blue whale in the room, I don't know, so to speak, it's the nursing homes. And in many countries, people who died either there or in hospitals, but who were nursing home residents, they like they amount to at least 50% of all death. In many U.S. states, maybe 2/3. Like, especially if we aren't talking about New York. But yes, so the thing is that if you pay attention and if you try to focus on policing the whole society, or in general, if your response tries to micromanage society, even to impose like universal wearing of masks, because I think this is what a lot of people who are even against lockdowns, they're now embracing these things. We should all wear masks because in Asia, like, they all wear masks, and I think that in the 21st century, with all the technology that we have and with all the resources that we have and all the ingenuity that we have, we can deal with this much better in a targeted way than by society-wide measures.
Great. I'm really glad you brought up the point about the nursing homes. Alex Berenson, who's been an interesting commentator on this, his pinned tweet has been recently about the fact that people aren't covering the just devastation of nursing homes, and the concentration of deaths in nursing homes just totally invalidates a lot of the media. I now see that he switched his pinned tweet to the new Neil Ferguson story, which you've probably seen, the funny story
Yeah, and it will be a
about him.
distraction actually, because even if Neil Ferguson were a saint of social distancing, but yeah,
Right.
I'll let you explain what the story is.
Right. No, it's right. It's like the evil, my view of Al Gore wanting to destroy civilization is not that. My primary argument against him isn't that he flies in a private jet, but that he wants to prevent billions of people from having the energy needed to, live in a small house. And so there's this uh, Neil Ferguson story. So this is the guy who created the Imperial College model, and it reminds me a lot of the energy issue, because he's like the Paul Ehrlich of epidemics, as far as I can tell. Paul Ehrlich is this ecologist who's been making horrifically wrong predictions for 50 years and demanding huge restrictions of freedom on the basis of it. And so Neil Ferguson was elevated as, I am the master forecaster, and so you got to lock down, otherwise we're all going to die. And then there's been this revelation that he had broken the lockdown to have sexual relations with a married woman, so he resigned over this. So he seems to be affirming it, and that's the current focus of Alex Berenson's tweet, which is a little bit vulgar for most episodes of this show, so I won't read the whole thing.
Yeah, and I would say it will be also a pity, because I mean it's again good politics, on, let's say, probably on our side, to show, like, look at those masters of our lives who fail to live up to their own. And actually Boris Johnson also, I mean, all the while everyone was like social distancing, he was refusing to do any social distancing, and ended up like having COVID-19 himself. But the thing is that I think even if like Neil Ferguson had been a saint of social distancing, his ideas would be as bad, every bit as bad as they are. So I think
Yeah, I agree. I agree
we
totally.
can
The same is
focus on
true of Gavin, and yeah.
and
So
sometimes it's even better to have people in charge who are not fanatics. I think that usually fanatics, in the sense, worse than those who cannot coherently follow their own.
mm-hmm.
But this is goes way beyond the topic of our conversation.
Yeah. So I didn't even mean to bring it up, but I was looking for his statement about the other thing, and then it cracked me up, so I couldn't leave the audience out of that one. So Daniel, it's been
No, but
great to
this is
have you
cool.
on.
It's fun
Okay.
in a sense, because it's like reality is stranger than fiction kind of thing. So it's
Yeah. So I just want to make sure people know how to learn more about you. So you have a very standard sounding name, but not a standard spelled name. So I'll just read it on Twitter, because I can read letters just as well as you can. It has to be spelled out. So at Twitter, so Daniel is Daniil. So it's at Daniil GOR. And so his follower count has been increasing, and I think I might be responsible for maybe 10% of his followers. So hopefully more after this. And then he posts at really interesting articles at Medium, at medium.com/@, and it's the same thing. Daniil Gore, DANIILGOR. Is there anywhere else people should look?
No, I think it's pretty much it. I mean, I have some articles on SSRN, but yeah, it's a bit more like preprint stuff. Yeah, so Medium and Twitter, yeah, it's basically the main outlet, so to speak.
Awesome. Well, stick around for a minute after, but thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
All right. Well, that an honor for me as well. Thanks again to Daniil Gorbatenko for coming on the show. I learned a lot from him, and as I mentioned at the outset, we're planning on working on an article together on this topic of safer outside. So I hope you share this episode, and also I'll let you know. I'm not sure when that article will be ready, but I do think it's a theme that really needs to be emphasized to discredit the lockdown and also to help guide better policies going forward. All right, this is the second Power Hour I've done, and I've done two in a day. I did part of this one yesterday and part of this one today, and I did the other one today, but plus I just did another interview, which I'll share in my newsletter. It was on a podcast called the Bus Driver Podcast, and it'll be available on YouTube as well. So you can search my name, the Bus Driver Podcast. That was a really interesting one because the host was familiar with my work, but he asked a bunch of, let's say, challenging questions. And I always think that that's one of the most useful situations when you can see my perspective and my framework challenged. I think it's right, and I think it stands up well to challenge. So I always welcome that. So check out that. But that has my voice is starting to die, so I'm gonna wrap up. So I'll just say, as usual, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, email me at alex@alexepstein.com. Also, thanks to everybody who's been supporting our work through the Accelerator program. This is a program that helps fund our research and development efforts, things like the Moral Case for Fossil Fuels 2.0. And it also helps our promotional efforts, things like having a TV booker to help me get more interviews and particularly more TV shows. So if you believe in the work we're doing and you want to support it during what's a pretty difficult business environment for us, those contributions help immensely. Really appreciate that. You can do that at industrialprogress.com/accelerate. That's industrialprogress.com/accelerate. All right, that's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay outside. It's safer outside. Until next time, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.